Reshaping Economic Engagement in a Rapidly Transforming World Order, Challenges and Opportunities for India. For this dialogue, can I request His Excellency Andre Aranha Correa do Lago, Ambassador of Brazil to India, Her Excellency Harinder Sidhu, Australian High Commissioner to India, Ambassador Parvatneni Harish Garu, IFS, Additional Secretary, Economic Diplomacy and States Division, Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India, Ambassador TCA Raghavan, Director General, Indian Council of World Affairs, and Ms. Suhasini Haider, Diplomatic Editor, The Hindu. Dialogue 1 will focus on reshaping economic engagement in a rapidly transforming world order and the challenges and opportunities for India in this context. So this dialogue 1 will focus on navigating the geopolitical disruptions to trade and commerce and the challenges and opportunities for India in this context. I request the Chair, Suhasini Haider, to take over. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Can you all hear me? Are we mic'd up? Yeah, I think so. Since the introductions have been done, we're just going to get right into it. We have about 15 minutes, and I'd like to keep at least half of those, if possible, for questions, because these are issues that for a long time have been thought of as arcane, and diplomacy and economic engagement is not something we really talked about so much, but today it seems to be the only issue everybody wants to talk about. Trade, economy is on the top of every government's mind, and as a result is at the top of every government's diplomacy. Now I'm on a stage here with 4 diplomats, so I will take my role, what's left, as agent provocateur over here very seriously, and set a little bit of the course that we hope to hear from our speakers about today. To start with, if you were to look at various global trends, I think a lot of what we try to analyze can be essentially worked into dealing with 3 basic challenges, and these are global trends. Every country is looking at these, and every country is trying to find their way through it. What are the 3 global trends? And you may or may not agree, but there is the retrenchment of the United States from several multilateral fora, from responsibilities in certain spheres, certainly out of World Trade Organizations in general, and the WTO in particular. That's one. The rise of China, the decision of China to take on a project like the Belt and Road Initiative. I'm sorry if you couldn't hear me before. The first being the retrenchment of the United States, the second being the rise of China taking on an aggressive role, not just in connectivity, but also in terms of trade. And the third would be, and again this is arguably, the rise of populism, of populist governments in power that essentially then have to cater to the kind of electoral promises they made going in. So around the world you will hear, make America great again, you will hear, make in India, you will hear, I think Britain has a made in Great Britain slogan as well, but you've got many variants of that in every part of the world. And those are promises people are feeling that they need to keep. Where does this leave India? Because this first session we're looking at very closely is how can India benefit? What are the challenges India faces going into it? Let's remember, we may be between the 3rd and the 7th largest economy in the world, but we are 19th when it comes to trade in export of goods. 19th means we contribute 1.65% of global exports. So that means that there's a lot of scope and you know, the only way is up from here. We also have a particular point of view when it comes to free trade agreements. The last time India actually successfully negotiated an FTA was in 2011. Since then, we've actually withdrawn from several investment agreements that came along with trade negotiations. And we are trying to figure out how we will go forward in the next few months. So I'm setting this course over here. In the next few months, there are certainly 3 sets of negotiations that India must look at very closely when it comes to economic engagement. The first is the Indo-US trade negotiations, which we hope to see something of in the next month. After that comes the decision on RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership of 16 countries, and whether India is going to go ahead with that, which will essentially put India into at least a preferential trade agreement, if not an FTA, with China and others. And the third is a long pending negotiation with the European Union, which has already, I think, got 46 or so FTAs around the world, and India is not one of them. It has practically, you know, got an FTA with everyone except India. So I'm going to first come to the ambassador of Brazil and ask you to set this in the stage of where the multilateral order is going when it comes to trade. What are the opportunities and the challenges? I hope I'm not giving any secrets away when I say that Brazil and India are in the middle of negotiations on an investment agreement that may well become the first investment agreement that India has signed in 7 years.
Very well. Can you hear me?
Why don't I give you the mic?
You should take the mic.
Here you go.
Well, thank you very much. I think that the first thing I would like to say is that that you described very well the circumstances that we're living, is that the structure that has been built after the war and during the Cold War was not a structure that had in mind India and Brazil. So the end of the Cold War and the new circumstances that you described put us in a situation in which we are obviously defending multilateralism. We are great participants of multilateralism, but multilateralism has a structure that does not really respect the importance of both our countries. So the first thing I want to comment is how we are reacting, because I think that Brazil and India are reacting quite similarly. And specifically on our case, we created 2 groups that were a kind of reaction to the international multilateral structure. One is the G4, and I think that we had discussions this morning about this issue. The G4 is because we are absolutely sure that both our countries and the 2 others would be extremely constructive in the Security Council. And we believe that we need this reform because our countries really have a lot to contribute. The second, and comes immediately to mind, is BRICS. And BRICS is not about the UN, it's about the Bretton Woods. So we have one structure, it's not anti-structure, but we are questioning the structure of the UN in the G4, and we are doing about the Bretton Woods institutions in BRICS. But BRICS is a complex group also because you have 2 members that are permanent members of the Security Council in the middle of BRICS, and so we also have IBSA. And IBSA is a very important structure that we have created between South Africa, India, and Brazil, in which we can show how multicultural societies like ours we are somehow, I thought of it this morning hearing some of the other speakers, we are disruptive countries. People don't know very well where to put us. And if we don't find the way that we put ourselves, nobody is going to help us be well situated anywhere. So I think that first I'd like to mention this reaction to this complex multilateral structure that was not designed with us in mind. The other thing, as you were mentioning, is somehow bilateral, but which is the free trade agreements. I have to tell you that this recent months, Brazil negotiates, as you know, free trade agreements in the context of Mercosur, now with Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay. And we have signed one with the European Union that took 20 years, so you should never lose hope. We also signed one this week with EFTA. I think we would be very happy to start negotiating with India and discussing with India the possibility of a free trade agreement, Mercosur-India. But these the mechanisms that we are developing, I think we have to put them in a context of an agenda. And I think that a very legitimate agenda that has appeared in recent years is the issue of sustainable development. And I will tell you why. Because I think that the sustainable development agenda, as it was designed for the 2030, has been not only heavily discussed between all the countries, but also in civil societies, and it was very well received by business also. So I think that this is the agenda, and then we have to have the instruments to achieve this agenda. And I want to say, since we are here in economic discussions in a wonderful business school, I want to comment that I think that in this agenda, in sustainable development, climate change, all these great subjects of our time that we all agreed are priorities, what is missing is economics. I think we started with science, we continued with politics, we continued with business, we continued with civil society, but I think that economists are still not contributing enough to that. And I think that when we're talking about the economy and trade and what we have to do, I think we have to have much more thinking about how to fit this into an agenda of sustainable development.
All right, very quickly, if I could, because part of what we're discussing today is the disruptive factors. Is Brazil looking very closely at the US-China trade war and how to benefit from it, or how it's an opportunity?
You know, one of the things that we see in the post-war is that, in principle, you don't need to be on one side or the other. So I think that we were talking about, I know we should not talk about that officially, but the G2, I mean, the two largest economies in the world, it's completely normal that they are having all these difficulties. It's completely normal. But I think that our countries have to put themselves in the position that, by the way, President Trump proposed in the General Assembly, is that he says he defends America first, but every country should defend his country first. So I think that we have to do that when we analyze the US-China difficulties.
Okay, if I could come to the Australian High Commissioner, Harinder Sidhu. Ambassador Criado-Lagos spoke about the idea that business is very positive. In fact, I would posit that in India, industry has always been very, very wary of FTAs. In the recent negotiations that we are looking at, and you are part of two separate negotiations, one is the CICA that I think has gone through 12 or 13 rounds already, and the other is the much larger RCEP, which may actually make the CICA not so necessary if it does go ahead. Give me a sense of where you see not just India's engagement with RCEP, but India's engagement in general with FTAs. And what are really the benefits? Because we always hear much more about the fact that FTAs haven't really worked for India. That in fact, if you look at all the countries that we did do FTAs with before 2011, India's got major deficits that have grown with each of them.
Thanks, Suhasini. Can I just start at the outset of saying Australia's gone through many rounds of economic reform, liberalisation, and it's not been our experience either that business thought it was a good idea at the time. So it's not unusual that business will push back on this. If we're going to talk about disruptions, actually how I would come at it is that there's probably three key disruptions we're talking about. One is the transformation of the global economy, so the sorts of things that have been talked about this morning. The shift in manufacturing and in other industries towards the use of technology, towards artificial intelligence, robotics, all those sorts of things. The second is the shift of economic power from west to east, and that's actually creating some structural changes as well. Not just China, by the way, that also includes India. And then the third are these headwinds that we talk about, the protectionism that's going on, the trade tensions that we're seeing, the use of economic power for strategic ends. All those things are starting to bring questions into the economic story that we're grappling with that go beyond strictly trade and business. So things like FDAs take on a whole other dimension. And I think we just need to consider what we might need to do to approach that. And free trade agreements are only part of the story. The first part of the story, I think, is to recognise that we're not going to be able to do this alone. And, you know, free trade agreement or not, Australia and India have built a very, very strong economic relationship in the last 10 years or so. And I was looking at the trade statistics just over the last 5 years, and we've seen it grow on average 15% per year, year on year, over the last 5 years, 10% alone in the last year. So that's a sign that there are economic drivers that build relationships between countries that don't entirely depend on a free trade agreement. And this is very important because there's a strong temptation when you're seeing all these protectionist measures being taken to also raise the walls yourselves. History shows us that short-term reaction has long-term consequences. To actually retreat into isolation is actually creates risks in the long term. When the world is moving the way I've described, so fast, through technology, etc., for every year, and this is something that Australia is grappling with, you know, we are also facing the same pushback and tensions. And the temptation is to withdraw, but we know that if we're not participating in the global economy, if we're not making ourselves more competitive and keeping up, for every year we fall back, that's another year that we will find it harder to catch up to the global economy. So free trade agreements are part of that story because they're about not doing it out by ourselves, it's about doing it with partners bilaterally and also through things like RCEP. It's about bringing that sense of confidence that we can actually deliver instead of, it's very difficult for one country to stand up and say, we think that open trade is the answer. But it is much easier for 15 or 16 countries to group together and to actually demonstrate the power of open trade, of regional integration through a thing like RCEP. And I think that really what you need to start all of that with is actually confidence that history says that, you know, we know this from many historical situations, that when you open and liberalise trade, economic growth will follow. And I think that that's the driving thesis behind RCEP. I know there's a worry that, you know, RCEP will open India's doors to 15 other economies, but the other way you can think about it is that RCEP opens the doors for Indian businesses into 15 other markets. And that's actually a really important recipe for the kind of growth that the government here is trying to achieve. And that's something that we truly believe in Australia. It's been our history, our experience. The result of our economic liberalisation and economic reform in Australia has been 28 years of uninterrupted economic growth. So uniquely amongst developed countries, we did not suffer an economic recession after the 2008 global financial crisis, for instance. So this is something that I guess I'm just giving you the Australian perspective, but this is how we see things.
Well, I'll tell you straight away how India sees it and how Indians see it. Because sure, there is one problem with getting, being flooded by goods from many other countries, including China. There's a problem with FTAs in general not benefiting us. But the real worry is when you say India will open itself up to economic growth as well. The truth is that trade is not the only part, trade in goods is not the only thing India is worried about. We're worried about trade in services, and we see economies around the world closing up, so they say, yeah, please open your economy so I can sell you products, and okay, maybe I'll take a few of your products in exchange, but I'm not taking any of your people.
Well, I suppose there's no easy answer to that, but I think the thing to do is to try and work through these issues as they come about. You know, from time to time, we all face trade barriers. In fact, what's really, Australian business would say India is a really difficult market to sell goods to. But even so, we find a way right? And I would say the same for India. So India may feel that it's very difficult to get their professionals into other countries, but actually the evidence shows that there's probably more Indian workers in other countries. In the case of Australia, fully 25% of all our temporary work visas go to one country, which is India. And the rest is shared around the rest of the 192 countries of the world. So, India is phenomenally successful because India has the talent. And that is really, in the end, if you are competitive, this is the point I'm making, if you are competitive, you will always find a way into these markets.
All right, and if I could put you on the spot, because we know there's a little countdown clock on the ASEAN website that tells you exactly when they expect RCEP to be signed, which is November 1st this year. If it all goes through, of course, you've already painted the picture that we expect to see. What happens if either RCEP is stopped or that RCEP goes ahead, but India is not a part of it? What does India stand to lose?
Was Mr. Harish going to answer that question?
He's going to sum it up at the end.
Damn. Excuse the French. Look, RCEP is both, I talked about how there is a growing merger between economic actions and strategic consequences. RCEP is more than just an economic agreement. It has strategic consequences. If you are trying to work to integrate India, as I see the Indian government doing, and look at the success of the Indian government's actions here. The world has embraced India. If you are trying to do that, you cannot do it in one area alone. You can't strike a set of strategic agreements and then sort of assume that that's going to work. The world is not working that way. The virtue of RCEP is not only that it opens the door to economic growth and liberalisation and trade and engagement with the regional community, but it also deals India in to the Indo-Pacific community in a very serious way. And I think that that's, the size of the Indian economy, the size of the Indian market means that on many things, India is a game changer. India is a swing state. We see this in technology all the time. The lowest renewable energy prices, India's ability has been to actually drop the price of renewable energy. And what does that do? Not just make it more accessible in India, it makes it more accessible around the world. Those are the kinds of things that India can bring to the world. And there's a genuine benefit to India being part of RCEP, which I'm very supportive. I think it's important, and I would do everything to encourage continued India engagement, and Australia is very supportive of that.
All right, we're going to get to Mr. Harish as well in just a bit, but if I could come to you, Ambassador Raghavan, who's also the Director General of the Indian Council for World Affairs, but has served in the region in particular. The fact is, FTAs are not just about these free trade agreements anymore. They're about regions coming together. So today you have the EU, which is the most regionally, centralized business, if you like. I think they have intra-regional trade at about 55 to 60%. You have, when the US and China, their trade dipped, which were the two countries that benefited? It was actually Canada and Mexico, because they already had their North American free trade agreement reworked and in place. Now you have something called RCEP. I want to ask you a little about India's own region, because of course we always forget that the one multilateral free trade agreement India was a part of was SAFTA, South Asian Free Trade Agreement, and yet in our region what we're looking at is intra-regional trade of 5.5%. I think it goes up to 6% at the maximum. And if you could also just bring in the issue of connectivity here, because we saw even India go a little further in the region to a country like Iran, and then find that connectivity seems to be a mantra everyone uses, but it's the most prone to disruptors that we have seen.
Well, when one talks about the economic, the point is that the politics always intrudes. SAFTA, as you said, was the great white hope a decade and a half ago, but geopolitics made sure that it would not succeed. Now, this is not something peculiar to just India and Pakistan or to South Asia. If you look at what is happening between South Korea and Japan today, Now, these are two highly integrated economies. They have supply chains which have been built up over the last 30 years over the whole range of economic activity. But in fact, every single one of their major agreements and major regimes constructed over the last 55 years is in fact tottering because of a debate and a division over issues which happened 75 years ago. So I think in Asia, and this is something we have to learn to live with, the geopolitics will always intrude into the economic. And if we think that economic integration is the silver bullet to solving political problems, I think we have to think again. We have to address the politics as an autonomous realm. And there, I think for India, the situation is actually very complex, because when one looks east, and we spoke about RCEP and ASEAN and so on, I mean, there is a whole world of opportunity, because you have very strong bilateral arrangements, which are also buttressed by equally strong or potential economic and regional arrangements. But when you look to the West, and if you look at the Arabian Sea littoral, and Iran is only one example, you have strong bilaterals, but there is virtually no regional arrangement. And every country in the Arabian Sea littoral has major disputes with one or more of its neighbors. Now, both the Arabian Sea littoral and the Bay of Bengal littoral are very much part of our immediate neighborhood. So when we talk about economic diplomacy, I think to think of constructing an economic program without focusing on the political will always run into these issues. One final point about connectivity, and I think this is something which everyone keeps repeating, that while we can focus on our external engagement, the real challenges for us remain domestic. And certainly, I think one great achievement was reducing, for instance, improving our ease of doing business index. But the challenge for India is how do we bring about greater convergence between the ease of doing business index and the HDI? Because your HDI really is not what it should be for a country of India's size and the size of its economy and the way it wants to engage with the world.
All right, and if I can push you a little bit just on this whole South Asian problem, where do you think South Asia really suffers? Is it in terms of just the political issues? I mean, you know, sometimes you think about even the unthinkable, and that is India-Pakistan, and you say that in the year that the World Bank came out with a study, that was called Glass Half Full, and said your potential is at least $40 billion. That is the year in which, India has dropped the MFN status for Pakistan, and Pakistan has now cancelled all trade with India. Is it at all possible to imagine a world where, I mean, I know you said politics always bleeds in, but is it possible to imagine a world where, when you look on the other side, Pakistan is the biggest market for India? We can talk about Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, and all the rest, but in terms of sheer size and in terms of connectivity, Pakistan should have been the sort of no-brainer. It should have had the kind of 75 years we saw between Japan and South Korea, for example.
No, I think there are always huge possibilities, and I don't think we can ever say that no, the situation is so bad that the future is entirely dismal. The Vice President said in the morning that our neighbors are permanent. We have to address relationships with them. But I think when we look at the region, and especially India in the context of South Asia, we have to be sensitive about our size and the fact that however large and however big our neighbors may also be in absolute terms, we dwarf them entirely. So when we talk about markets, every neighbor has a point about the balance of trade. And they say you are so sensitive about your trade imbalance with China, but why aren't you equally sensitive about our huge trade imbalance with you? And I think the way forward certainly will be being sensitive to our size and making sure that their particular sensitivities on issues which are central to their economic thinking are taken into account.
All right. To come to P. Harish, and really all of this comes on to you. I think we just need to pass one mic down. Simply because you're dealing with the international situation, you deal with the disruptors there, you deal with the challenges of regional trade, you deal with the other challenges of dealing with businesses, and then you have the problem of ensuring that every state gets its share when it comes to the central pie. What are the sort of tools? What is the way forward? Where do you see India going in response to some of the challenges that have been brought up by the panelists? And what are the tools that the Ministry of External Affairs in particular needs to equip itself with or is equipping itself with?
I think for the benefit of the audience, what we should be very clear is that historically and civilizationally, India has been an outward-looking country. We have been a maritime nation from the time of the Harappan civilization. The port of Lothal, trade with Mesopotamia. So we have been a trading nation from antiquity. It continued during the Guptas, it continued during the Cholas. We have always been outward looking, we traded. We had a significant share of world trade. And this included exchange of ideas that went along with trade, whether it was through the platform of Buddhism, of Hinduism, of Islam, of Judaism, which moved places. We have been part of these movements of ideas, of people, and of goods and services. There has been a hiatus in the Middle Ages, and after that, I think even during the British colonial period, we have had a significant part of trade as part of the empire. It was Indian rupee, which was a traded currency in most parts of the Gulf. We were a very outward-looking country. I think this, again, there was a break after independence for a couple of decades. And since the economic reform program, again, trade has been and continues to be a very important part of the agenda. However, in today's context, attracting investments has taken precedence over a singular focus on trade. When you look at other countries like Singapore, where bilateral trade is about 250 to 300% of GDP. Even for a country like Vietnam, it's about 200% of GDP. I think in our case, trade has not received probably the same attention, both at the level of state governments and at the level of business and industry. So I think getting back to focus on trade would be a very useful metric for us to look at and its contribution to the overall economic engine. I think if you look at the broad aspects, one aspect again which we need to look at, and Ambassador Raghavan pointed to it. I think at the level of aggregates, our figures are very good. We are in nominal terms the 6th largest country, economy. In terms of PPP, we are the 3rd largest. But if you look at the disaggregated level in terms of per capita GDP, our per capita GDP is still in the range of $2,100. Again, if you look at production of milk, production of rice, various indicators in agriculture, we are again in the world's top producers. But if you look at crop productivity per hectare, a lot leaves to be desired. In crop after crop, our productivity per hectare is much, much below the global level, and certainly below the leaders in these particular crops. The same holds true for socio-economic indicators, for health indicators, nutritional indicators. So I think there is a huge disconnect between aggregated reality and disaggregated reality as far as we are concerned. And that is where the government's focus is. We have achieved a certain stage of economic development, and now the focus is on human development and making available the tools for each of our citizens to reach their full potential. And this is where the future focus of government's efforts and economic diplomacy is going to be. What do we do to ensure that the figures at the aggregate also reflect at the per capita disaggregated level so that it makes a tangible difference in the lives of our citizens? I think in terms of other issues, yes, we talk of free trade, but institutions of global free trade, especially in the case of the WTO, have not been as effective in the last few decades. We have, of course, issues of trade diversion. We have FTAs, we have regional agreements, we have PTAs. And every country is scrambling to make sense of it, to see that they are not left out of this process. And in the process, there has been massive systemic economic inefficiencies that have been built as there is trade diversion going on in every geography and sub-geography. So while we talk of free trade, it's not actually free trade in a global sense, in an economic sense. What we have is a melange or a noodle bowl of free trade agreements and PTAs, which countries are entering into due to a desire not to be left out of the process. And I think in this, while India has been, as you said, entered into a number of free trade agreements, what we also see is a de-tariffization of these free trade agreements. So every major player has brought down their tariffs to zero or near zero, and they're happy in the situation that their tariffs are low. Yet, what we see is a huge increase in non-tariff barriers being erected. Now, we have not been able to play this game as our free trade agreement partners have done with the same dexterity. So we have a situation where we have entered into agreements, but our exporters face a significant obstacle in dealing with non-tariff barriers. So the de-tariffization of the so-called free trade has been a significant factor, not just for India, but for major economies, including the US. For example, yes, most free trade agreements have a strategic angle, they have a strategic element. And yet, a country like the US has chosen to move out of the TPP precisely because of the de-tariffization and the erection of non-tariff barriers, which has generated a domestic backlash. So governments no longer can afford to ignore the cry of the industry and even of the common citizen that these free trade agreements and the de-tariffization, especially for countries who would play by the spirit and the letter of the free trade agreements, they are at the receiving end if you are not in a position to erect WTO compliant non-tariff barriers, in effect blocking access for your free trade agreement partners. So this is something which all governments have to take note of, and probably it is this development that has prompted for even the US to withdraw from the TPP. So I think in India we are going through a consultation process. The government is actively consulting business and industry, taking feedback. I mean, you're from the media. You see every day the reports of the CII, the FICCI, the ASSOCHAM.
They're not happy.
And they'll give you a list of exactly the de-tariffization phenomena, the erection of non-tariff barriers with each of our free trade agreement partners, which has effectively shut out these markets and prevented market access for their exports. So I think this is something we need to address. Yes, there is a security angle to free trade agreements. There is a strategic angle to free trade agreements. Yet, we also have to keep in mind the effective WTO compliant procedures being used to stymie the implementation of the spirit and the letter of these free trade agreements. And so no government can afford to ignore it. The US could not ignore it, and our government is in consultation with all stakeholders, including business and industry stakeholders. So that is a process that is still going on, and I would not like to pre-guess or prejudge it. So I think we should wait for that process to complete. And I think in terms of other elements that are likely to have an impact on the future trend of globalization and other issues, I think we have to keep in mind that yes, political factors are important, geopolitical factors are important, yet there are also significant factors which are in its essence very economic in nature. Like for example, the issues of economic inequality within nations are issues that are impacting upon the future course of economic integration globally. The issues of immigration have assumed far greater importance than the whole matter of geopolitical developments. So I think more than earth-shattering geopolitical developments, issues like immigration, issues like climate change, issues like economic inequality and job situation within countries are having and are proving to be far more significant determinants of the future of globalization and what course they would take, rather than big bang geopolitical developments. I think we also see new developments, the rise of new financial institutions, both regional and global. And again, here I would say, yes, there was a time when you had global institutions, there was a time you had regional institutions, but increasingly the preference is for plurilateral institutions, coalitions of the willing, and Ambassador just pointed out to IPSA, to various other organizations. We have trilateral initiatives, for example, on development partnership in Africa with Japan. We are trying to do with France. We have various other initiatives with like-minded countries in various geographies and sub-geographies of the world. So I think these plurilateral mechanisms will increasingly see where there is an element of semi-formality. There may not be formalized structures or institutional structures, but these are coalitions of the willing, and these seem to be the way forward. And I think as a country, we are committed to remain engaged with all of our partners to see what is best for our business industry and for our citizens, and yet to be open to global developments, to be engaged with the outside world, and to take full advantage of regional mechanisms and international mechanisms.
All right. 4 years ago, India did away with all its investment agreements. The question really, do you see the future with India signing a whole slew of investment and trade agreements altogether, because this is a multipolar world? Which is the first one you see us doing?
I think we are constantly in the process of signing a number of investment agreements with the same partners, and most of them have reached completion with the same partners. But again, it's the same problem. Just like you have a de-tariffization of so-called free trade, you've also had many things that were not with the spirit and the letter of the agreements that crept in terms of our investment agreements, which had led to distortions. So this was an attempt to correct it, and I think our partners understand it, and that's why we have negotiated new bilateral investment treaties in good faith.
And they continue to be patient. Very quickly, I do want to ask, since you brought up tariffs so many times, India is also called a tariff king by one particular country. And the case of the Harley-Davidson really comes to mind. Do you think, actually, we are now in a situation, and how much pressure do you feel in the department you're in? Do you feel now that trade relationships are bleeding into your political relationships? In other words, the opposite of what Ambassador Raghavan was speaking about.
As I said, I think we have to keep in mind that a lot of our trade relationships would be guided by its eventual impact on common people. And I think this is something we cannot ignore. And as Ambassador Raghavan said, domestic issues are very important, and it's not really big bang geopolitical issues, but domestic issues and the well-being of our citizens that is very important to any elected government. So I think when we look at this, the focus is how do we craft our international engagement in a manner that it elevates, empowers, and gives more choices to our own citizens, rather than the other way around. I think this is the focus, and that's why whenever there is a relook at some of these issues, it is only because, again, I repeat, probably we have not played the game as our partners have, but then we didn't understand the game. So I think we have not primed up our industry to take advantage of the various provisions of the free trade agreements we signed in. We didn't bring greater awareness and didn't engage the industry like our partners have. I see in many partner countries, before they sign a free trade agreement, there is a 3-year lead time when they prime their industry to take advantage. And in its rollout, you're constantly engaged with the industry. I think that kind of an engagement we didn't have. And probably we didn't, as I said, understand the game. And when you deal with non-tariff barriers, I think we are completely flummoxed. So I think now there is a realization that this is a reality and we need to deal with it.
Okay, you see the diplomatic answers I am getting. So I'm going to quickly take three questions from the audience, come back and close it over here. Is there anyone in the audience with a question? Oh my God, I see a lot of hands up. Okay, I see one hand here, one hand there. and one right in front. So if you could just stand up one by one and, yeah, there. That one. No, sir, there's someone.
Hello. Yeah, Madam, I'm Dr. Bharat, and my question is to Secretary Harish. We are talking about economic diplomacy, and we being one of the biggest nations in the world, we are talking about billion-plus population. My question is, how effective this diplomacy India can take forward towards the world with so much problem in our backyard? Ma'am was talking about 200 million plus
Fair
market.
point. Sir, I'm
Yeah.
going to cut you off only
Yeah.
because I want to take a few more questions. But
Yes.
I get your point with all the problems in our
Thank
own
you.
backyard. Where do we go? There's a lady over there.
Hello, thank you for the question. So, very insightful comments from all the panelists, and my question is directed to Sir Harish. So, really insightful point about the difference between aggregate reality and disaggregate reality. So, talking about economic inequality and especially also sustainability, I mean, how national governments and also foreign governments are thinking about it, because what I see is investments in again the same cities where development is already there. For example, I was part of a UP Investor Summit also, so I was hoping investment will be there in tier 2 cities, but again it was Noida I was hearing of. So what are we planning about that? Because unless we address that, like more development in tier 2 cities, so reducing economic inequality even through trade and not just national policies. So how will
The problem of building our tier 2. You had a question, sir?
I'm Pradeep. I would like to take a clue from what our Vice President has said about the 3 C's, cuisine, cinema, and none of them were promoted by the government.
The people.
So, and our minister from Andhra Pradesh, he was saying that IT also has come up on its own, not because of government. So I would like to know one thing. Are you seeing any more such things coming up? Are you looking for any trends? Are you looking for any strengths, other strengths within the country?
All right. Is the relationship going to just be on the back of the people and the gentleman there, and that's the last I can take? Go ahead.
Trade, keeping in considerations there are so many free trade agreements which have been signed since 1990s, early 80s and
Sure.
all. Many of them have been complementing the earlier free trade agreements. Many of them have complemented them, contributed to the free trades, taking them to the next stage, and many of them are conflicting in nature.
Okay, I don't understand, but is there a question in there?
The
You
question
said
is, how do we actually, from a country perspective, how do we ensure that these 3 C's, complement, contribute, and conflictings, are not being, or have been mitigated when we are doing a new free trade agreement?
all right. I can always tell when we're speaking after Mr. Naidu because we always get a lot of catchphrases out of it. Does anyone want to tackle? I think 2 of the questions came to you. So,
I think you're very right, but again, as you heard our Minister of State mention, he said, the Prime Minister believes that the business of government is not to be in business. So, as you rightly said, these 3 C's are something which are where the government has not had a role. This is inherently cultural, and the IT industry too. There has been a lot of impetus from the business and industry. So I think it would be very appropriate to say that the role of the government is only as a facilitator. And if the industry wants any particular aspect of facilitation, I don't think the government inherently believes that it needs to be in a particular business sector. Its role is to help industry in that particular sector based on a felt need and a request made by the industry. And I think that's a way, for example, we would look at our work too. If we are to facilitate any aspect of business, it is only a facilitation, And that is what we do, whether we are taking members of the diplomatic corps to some of our state capitals, whether we are partnering with ISB in organizing conferences like this, like the Deccan Dialogue. It is only a facilitation that we are doing. And I think the larger issue, yes, trade is important. Trade can create jobs. And if you look at issues that can be done from within, I think a much more focused effort on trade, on tourism, and agriculture. These are three things which can really transform and really make a material change to the lives of many of our citizens, and hence a focus on some of the disaggregated data. If you can improve per hectare crop productivity, double it or triple it, it will make a huge difference in the lives of our farmers. If you can enhance and make available export markets by aligning it with GAP, good agricultural practices, and enable their exports, it will instantly improve the lives of farmers.
All right. I'm going to ask the two ambassadors to take the question from the lady who said, how do we ensure that it's actually, diversified, where the investment comes in, where the trade with other countries comes in? And if you want to just give us very quickly, maybe 3 places where you think India really needs to up its game when it comes to trade.
Well, I think that in that context, we have to remember that all these issues of trade, free trade agreement, etc., they are not objectives. They are instruments. We have to have an agenda. And our countries, in the case of Brazil and India, our countries have so much that obviously we need, as you were saying, to organize ourselves, our priorities, what the government has to insist, what the society has to build, so that we attract, for instance, foreign direct investment. I'm going to tell you something that is quite surprising, but Brazil has been growing, as you know, very slowly, even amazingly slowly compared to India. But we had recession, we had 1%, and this year we're going to have 1%. But in 2016, we were the 7th destination of foreign direct investment. In 2017, we were the 4th destination of foreign direct investment. Why? Because the numbers have to be interpreted into what really the potential and the reality of the countries. I think sometimes I get tired of people talking about potential. We are already incredible economies. We are already incredible societies. And I think that this is what attracts. Now, concentrating on how do we sign, what are the terms of the agreement, etc. I totally agree with you, because you create the terms of the agreement, you sign the agreement, and then you have a series of new things that are created so that the agreement doesn't work the way it should. So I'm quite optimistic because of our societies, because they really have a potential to bring much more ideas and much more opportunities, and to attract from basically everywhere. I'm sorry to say that, but if you take some countries are much smaller than our countries. Some countries have a small population. Some countries, they have to do anything because they have very few options. Maybe we have the problem of having too many options, and we discuss a lot. We love to discuss a lot among ourselves.
Are huge.
So I think there are probably 2 points I think I need to make here. One is that in designing free trade agreements more generally, and I'm only speaking from the Australian experience again, there are 2 elements that we do. One is that we actually look at, obviously inputs by business, and there's a long engagement with business, and I was very happy to hear that recognition on your part. I think that's exactly right, Mr. Harish. But the second part how we come at it is we actually look at the link between domestic economic reform and what we're trying to get out of the free trade agreement. And the domestic economic policy, domestic economic reform piece, it is about balancing the inequality question. And when we do that, of course, we don't take a short-term view. We are looking at, a free trade agreement has a life of many years or decades, so what is the economic point we want to get to in, say, 30 years' time? And so even if a domestic reform might cause some short-term disruption, is there a long-term gain to be doing this? So the inequality question is looked at in terms of the domestic consequences,
and the domestic potential that we can reach by using the free trade agreement. So that's one point. You asked about the sorts of things that India needs to look at, and it's terrible for ambassadors to give advice, because what would we know? We've only been here a short while. But there is one point. There is a linkage between trade and investment, and India, while many people will say, India has barriers to trade, it has very few barriers to investment. The liberalization of investment here has been phenomenal. But the difficulty is, I think, you will get some investment in some areas, but if there were more trade, investment would flow. So I'll give you an example. Australian agricultural producers that have been working with the Indian system recognize that there is a value in investing in distribution networks in India, in building silos, in managing those sorts of things, and actually building the supply chains that India needs, not just so it helps their trade, but also so India can perform more efficiently. So when we are thinking about trade and tariffs, etc., I think thinking about how that links to the investment story is one thing that's actually worth considering.
All right. And I know we're running very, very, very short of time, so very quickly, how do we become $5 trillion when our backyard is on fire?
Well, I think you can't look at any region of the globe where somebody or the other's backyard is not on fire. All neighboring country relationships are difficult. And I think this is, it's almost like a law of nature. But just this point about number of FTAs and do we have the bandwidth, I think it's an important point. Because there's also the question of, is there too much government? And what Harish said, that how did we fail in reaching out and educating business about what FTAs contain? We've had this debate in the Ministry of External Affairs, and it was a national debate almost for 15 years about the size of the MEA, that it's too small and it needs to be. We've never had this debate about the Commerce Ministry, which does so many FTAs, and do we have the bandwidth? And I would say that the question is not so much about is there too much government, but where does government focus its efforts on? And certainly we need much more government in administering FTAs, educating people about FTAs, and reflecting industry concerns about FTAs.
With that, I'm going to just hand it over to you, but a round of applause for for some very forthright views from diplomats. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I request Ambassador Ravi Shankar Aisola, former Indian ambassador to Laos, to please come onto the stage to hand over a memento to the speakers. Ambassador TCA Raghavan. Ms. Suhasini Haider. Her Excellency Australian High Commissioner to India. His Excellency Ambassador of Brazil to India. And to our friend and partner Sri Parvatneni Harish Garu. Thank you. Can I also request all the speakers to pose for a group photograph?